Carter's genuine love for popular music has been well documented and was used to great effect during his political career. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Randall Stevens about his book, The Devil's Music: How Christians Inspired, Condemned, and Embraced Rock and Roll. Our conversation revealed unexpected and interesting intersections in faith, race, and American popular culture.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The time for racial discrimination is over. That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
it is a crisis of confidence.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
To remove the light of war and the threat of war would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
The Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
I'm Randall Stevens, and I'm professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo. I started out originally as a historian of holiness and Pentecostalism in the American South and was very much focused on the South. The book that I did about music, it comes from this interest in Southern Pentecostalism especially, and locating the music, locating rock music in its origins, rock and roll, partially within this religious community that was more open to innovation and to different styles of worship that were more animated than other churches in the regions, like Methodists or Baptists, for instance.
Jimmy Carter was born in the Deep South, in rural Southwest Georgia in 1924. You've done a lot of historical research about the cultural context of the South during that time and from that time to the present day. Tell us a little bit about the world that Jimmy Carter was born into. It's
a world that is quite a mixed population of blacks and whites, but it's a world that is shaped by Jim Crow and racism that Carter becomes aware of even as a very young man. There's some really good bits written about this in Randall Balmer's religious biography of Carter, about that kind of background for his life. And I think one of the reasons for later that Carter is so interested in music, and especially Southern music, is because of this lived experience as a young man in rural Georgia of seeing how music shaped life in black and white contexts, and how energizing and how good for the soul music is, maybe more than any other president, definitely in modern history. Carter's sort of dipping into this well of regional experience and taking quite a bit out of that, even into his presidency.
So as you mentioned, that lifelong love of music was really a defining feature of both his candidacy and, of course, his presidency. Let's talk about that a little bit. You write in your book about both the love for music in general and specifically his love for religious music. How did he incorporate that into his political identity and even just his personal identity?
It's fascinating that it's both the religious and the non-religious music that's there, a really critical central part of his presidency in the cultural sense, and also in the political sense, that he has Aretha Franklin, who performs at his inaugural in 1977, along with Paul Simon. And he is an enormous fan of black gospel and white gospel music, along with, sort of branching out as well into secular rock music that would strike a lot of other white evangelical Christians as problematic, to say the least. Carter's fandom of Southern rock, and also the fact that these Southern rock acts like the Allman Brothers supported his candidacy, along as well with, as far as speaking about religion, as James Brown, the sort of one of the founders of funk and such a critical voice in soul music, also supports Carter in 1976. And Brown really kind of brings the vitality of Black gospel singing and the performance style of Black gospel musicianship onto the stage. And you can clearly see that Carter is fascinated with this in a more kind of explicitly religious context, but also in a more kind of secular variant of it.
Do you think that that is evidence of just liking both sides, or did he really conceive of it as kind of one unified thing? Is Carter really living secular and sacred lives, or for him is this idea of public service part of his sacred duty, do you think?
I think it's really a product of Jimmy Carter's intellectual curiosity and his being drawn to areas of life and of culture that he just is naturally interested in or curious about. And there's this classic story of that his son Chip got him into other kinds of music, and in part with the music of Bob Dylan. That in part is sort of Carter, who's older, discovering this music that has inspired a younger generation, and becomes a big fan of Dylan, in part through his son, who introduces him to it. And Dylan is someone, I think, for Carter and for so many others, because his music is so rich with themes about life in all its varieties, and suffering and political struggles, especially in the early career of Bob Dylan. But by the time of Carter's presidency is when Dylan has moved into born again music with evangelical themes. So there's also this kind of confluence of trends by the late 1970s that Carter is certainly part of, and so is Bob Dylan.
It's a really interesting time period in the history of American popular music, because you've got Bob Dylan, who certainly by the mid 70s is well known all across the world. He has this moment of spiritual awakening, as you described, what in the American evangelical context is often being called born again. And he actually works with prominent Christian musicians such as Keith Green, and you've got other musicians like Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill, who Carter actually invites to the White House to play a concert, right? You write about that in your book.
Yeah, this concert that he has in September 1979, the old-fashioned gospel sing-in concert, it's a great moment in not just religious history, but also in the history of the presidency, when this kind of evangelicalism, both black and white, is much more visible. And that's present at this concert that's hosted on the White House lawn by Carter. It's interesting, when I was doing the research about it and writing, it's also at this time when journalists are picking up on this story and writing about the new kind of cultural power that evangelicals have and their new visibility on the American landscape. When Carter ran for president in 1976, one of his advisors was a little bit vexed by Carter's born-again Christianity, because he worried that it was just so weird to the larger American public that it would require too much explaining. And he actually called it, I think, the weirdo factor. But by the late 70s, and especially by the 80s, there was just much more evangelicalism on the public stage than there had been before. And part of that has to do with Christian rock music and with the explosion of evangelical churches in these years and in these decades. Something that was, would have been pretty unimaginable in the early 1960s and the mid 1960s, but by this period is just a part of array of pop music subgenres and genres.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting insight into how popular music can interact with culture and even with politics, right? To change the face in about the span of a decade. And Carter being a Southern politician becoming president, would have been absolutely unthinkable just a few years prior. But then he only is this one-term president, and things shift in a completely different different direction in the 80s with Reagan. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's the deal there, right? Like, Carter should have been really poised to ride waves of popular support and surge in the youth vote into higher levels, but that never materialized. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said youth vote too, because Carter certainly, in some ways, is part of a kind of generational shift in his presidency. There's a great short piece in Rolling Stone by David Brown where he talks about that a little bit, and he ties it to the kind of music that was in the White House in the Carter years, and said that even Carter himself, in his acceptance speech in Madison Square Garden at the Democratic Convention in 1976, he says, describes his look, his semi-blow-dried hair, and he said he looked less like a politician and more like an FM rock station owner, which I found kind of a powerful image there. But, this is a fascinating question, I think, for historians and political scientists about what went wrong, because Carter became such a very unpopular president in many ways, like another Democrat, Harry Truman, whose unfavorable rating was really high. And Carter, in the late 1970s, because of the economic crisis, the oil crisis, the Iranian hostage situation, the perception of Carter as weak and ineffective. And then in the religious context, this surge of anti-Carter feeling that roils the evangelical world in these years and makes a lot of them move into the camp of Reagan, even though Reagan, by comparison, is so a-religious and vague in his own religious life compared to Carter. Reagan's projection of strength is being a cold warrior before and at the time when he ran, and the way that he presented himself was just so much more appealing to evangelicals, to white evangelicals, for instance. That must be part of the equation. There's another thing here, too, that is quite fascinating. I was just looking at this today. The White House had a record library, which was started under the Nixon administration in 1973. And Carter and his staffers were populating that record library with albums in these years. And so it included things like Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, the Rolling Stones' Let It Bleed, Led Zeppelin 4, Bowie's Hunky Dory, and even Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica. And that same library was dismantled when Reagan came into office in 1981, and it was packed off the grounds of the White House. So it's a funny kind of symbolic change, a little bit like the Reagan administration taking the solar panels off the roof of the White House when they came into office.
Yeah, that's like the popular culture corollary, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you I was looking a little bit at it's a great contrast in the kinds of musicians that Reagan had come to the White House and the ones that Carter had come to the White House. Reagan's were sort of hearkening back to a bygone era of mid-century America, and its contrast to this more kind of countercultural bent of the Carter presidency.
I mean, it's one of the fundamental natures of a conservative versus a progressive political ideology, right? One looks forward and one looks back, and it's much easier to agree on that shared past than it is on the possibilities of the future.
And part of that, too, I think, is that the 60s is such an important kind of watershed era in America, sort of dividing line. To change the metaphors, it's sort of like a Rorschach test. You ask people what they think of certain developments in the 60s, cultural developments especially, or pop cultural, and that tells you a lot about where they're situated on the political spectrum today.
As we kind of wrap up, what do you think historians have gotten wrong about Carter, about his presidency, and in what ways do you think our collective memory of Carter is ripe for a reimagining?
Well, I think that in a broader sense, Carter's post-presidency career has made us reevaluate a bit about who he is, who he was as a leader, and as an individual, because he's had such a long and successful and productive career after his presidency with humanitarian work and with diplomatic work, that it's changed, I think, in the rearview mirror, what we think about his presidency. I suppose now it's fun to see this renewed kind of focus on some of the cultural themes of his presidency, and not just the political problems, the economic crisis, and all these other things, but to sort of expand it out, like this very recent documentary film that got quite a bit of attention about music in the Carter White House.
Rock and roll president.
Yeah, I think it came out in 2020, maybe.
Yeah.
That kind of attention, I think, fills out how we understand a leader like this, that they're not just political leader, but they also have a kind of cultural role to play, and even sort of putting a sort of stamp of approval on this music that would have been so anathema to, say, the Nixon White House or even the Ford White House in between, marking this kind of shift in a way.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.